It was a quiet Friday night at Max's Roadhouse, a bar just outside of Nashville where regulars gathered to unwind. The sounds of chatter, clinking glasses, and jukebox tunes filled the air, creating the perfect atmosphere for an evening out. But this night, something was about to happen that would change everything. The usual crowd was gathered at the bar, chatting about sports, life, and the things that matter little in the grand scheme of things. But in the far corner, nearly swallowed by shadows, sat an old man. He wasn't a part of the usual crowd, he sat alone, quietly sipping from his glass, his military cap resting on his head. His name was Jack Carson. Few people in the bar knew him, but by the end of the night, they would never forget him. The door swung open with a burst of energy as a group of rowdy bikers entered, all clad in black leather jackets with patches and slogans. The regulars glanced at them but quickly looked away, not wanting to draw attention. But the bikers were in no mood to be ignored. Their leader, a towering figure with a thick beard and an easy smile, slammed his hand on the bar and ordered beers for the crew. They had come for a good time, and a little trouble. That's when one of the younger bikers spotted Jack sitting in the corner. "Check this out," he nudged his friend. "Grandpa's out past his bedtime." Laughter erupted from the group, and the tension in the air began to shift. What started as a quiet night was about to take a sharp turn. Max's Roadhouse was buzzing with the usual Friday night energy, the clinking of glasses, the hum of jukebox tunes, and the familiar chatter of regulars. But in the corner, nearly swallowed by the dim light, sat a man who seemed entirely out of place. His name was Jack Carson, a name few knew, but one that would soon be etched in the minds of everyone present that night. Jack sat alone, nursing a glass of whiskey, the same way he had done for decades. The leather cap perched on his graying head bore the insignia of military service, an artifact of his past that he rarely spoke of. His face, weathered by time, reflected the toll of years spent in far-off lands. But his eyes, sharp and steady, told a different story, a story of strength and wisdom that many couldn't recognize. The door to the bar swung open with a force that rattled the windows. And in came 6 bikers, their leather jackets adorned with patches that screamed rebellion. They were loud, brash, and looking for trouble. But tonight, trouble would find them. Their leader, Tank, was a towering figure with a thick beard that seemed to be part of his persona. He slapped the bar, demanding beers for his crew. As they scanned the room with their usual swagger, the regulars glanced at them, but no one dared to engage. That's when one of the younger bikers spotted Jack in the corner. "Look at this guy," the biker sneered, nudging his friend. "What's an old man doing in here? Past his bedtime, huh?" Laughter rippled through the group as they took a few steps toward Jack's table. But Jack didn't flinch. He didn't even acknowledge their presence. He simply lifted his glass, took a slow sip, and returned to studying the whiskey in his hand. Tank, ever the instigator, saw this as a challenge. "Hey, Grandpa, you in the wrong place," he jeered, slapping his hand on the table. But still, Jack remained silent, his face unreadable. "Maybe he's one of those war vets," Tank mocked. "You know, the kind who sits around talking about the good old days." The bartender, Charlie, a grizzled man who had seen more bar fights than he cared to count, stepped in. "Leave him alone," Charlie said, his voice firm but calm. "He's not bothering anyone." But the bikers were far from ready to back down. Tank turned to his crew. "I think it's time we paid our respects," he said, striding toward Jack's table with an air of self-assured arrogance. As they approached, the noise in the bar quieted, and all eyes turned to the impending confrontation. Tank stopped just a few feet away from Jack, towering over the seated man. "Nice hat you got there," he said, grinning. "Military, huh? You see some action back in the day?" Jack didn't respond. Instead, he adjusted the brim of his cap, took another sip of his whiskey, and set the glass down with deliberate care. Tank leaned in closer, his voice dripping with mockery. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" Jack's hand stayed steady, the look in his eyes unwavering. "Do you boys need something?" he asked in a calm, low voice. The air in Max's Roadhouse grew thick with tension. The once lively chatter of the bar silenced by the standoff between the old man and the bikers. Even the jukebox seemed to pause in anticipation, its rock anthem now a distant echo, replaced by the sharpness of the moment. The regulars, who had long learned to mind their business when trouble brewed, now shifted uneasily in their seats, casting quick, furtive glances toward the bartender, Charlie. But Charlie stayed behind the bar, his eyes narrowing, his fingers twitching around the rag he was using to wipe down the counter. Tank, unaccustomed to being ignored, leaned forward, his bulk blocking the dim light from Jack's corner. He laughed, a deep, guttural sound, his chest puffed with bravado. "You're really not gonna say anything, old man? Is that it? You really think I won't make you?" Jack didn't move. His posture remained straight, as though the years hadn't bent his back. The years hadn't stolen the power from his stance. He merely looked up at Tank, the deep creases in his face betraying nothing. There was a quiet authority in his gaze that made Tank hesitate for just a split second. Though the biker leader quickly smirked, shaking off the discomfort. "Come on, Pops," Tank sneered, grabbing the brim of Jack's military cap. The room seemed to hold its breath as Tank lifted the cap high, taunting the old man with it. "Let's see what's so special about this old hat of yours. Bet it's full of stories, right?" The younger bikers chuckled. Some even stepped forward, egging Tank on. The mood was turning more hostile by the second, and Jack could feel the shift in the air. Still, he remained calm. Still, his eyes never leaving Tank's. He took a slow breath, as though preparing for something that was inevitable but not yet fully understood by the men before him. Without warning, Jack stood up, the movement slow but deliberate. The noise in the bar seemed to amplify around him, every creak of wood beneath his boots echoing like a drumbeat. The space between him and Tank closed with quiet certainty. The bikers shuffled back, unsure of what to expect next. Jack was a small man, but his presence loomed large in that moment. "Give it back," Jack said, his voice a low growl, his hand extended to retrieve his cap. There was no aggression in his words, only the weight of authority that made Tank's grin falter. Just for a moment. Tank, however, wasn't ready to back down. He held the cap up higher, his grin widening as he circled Jack. "What's the matter, old man? You want this back? You think I'm scared of you? You gonna cry for it?" The younger bikers snickered nervously, but even they could sense the change in the atmosphere. They were accustomed to breaking people, to shaking down the weak. But this felt different. Something in the old man's eyes, a quiet storm that seemed to warn them of a danger they didn't fully understand. Jack didn't flinch. He just kept staring at Tank, his hands at his sides. Steady, unyielding. "Give it back," he repeated, his voice calm but unwavering. Tank's bravado was slowly eroding, but he refused to let go of the cap. He jabbed a finger into Jack's chest, his voice rising. "What's your problem? Huh? You think you're better than us? You think you've earned some kind of respect just because you wore that hat?" He spat out the words like venom, each syllable dripping with contempt. The room grew quieter, the tension so thick that it was almost suffocating. Even the regulars who had been ignoring the scene up until now couldn't tear their eyes away. They'd seen their fair share of fights in this bar. But this was something different, a power struggle. An old man against a group of brash, cocky bikers. And everyone could feel it. Jack's gaze didn't waver, but the subtle shift in his body language suggested that he was done with words. Slowly, deliberately, he reached up and grabbed the cap from Tank's hand, his fingers brushing against the younger man's. The touch was light, but it sent a shiver down Tank's spine. "You don't understand," Jack said quietly, his voice now carrying the weight of years. "This hat isn't just some decoration. It's a part of who I am. It represents a life of service. A lifetime of sacrifices that you'll never know." Tank blinked, caught off guard by the old man's words. For a moment, there was silence, the bikers unsure of how to respond. Tank had expected resistance, maybe some shouting, but not this calm, controlled confrontation. Charlie, the bartender, took a step forward, his voice steady but firm. "Tank," he said, cutting through the tension, "I'm warning you. You have no idea who you are messing with." The air in the bar seemed to freeze at Charlie's words. The tension that had been building now exploded in silence. Everyone in the room waited, breaths held, to hear what would come next. The bikers looked at Charlie, their confusion mounting. But Tank's bravado didn't waver. He squared up with Charlie, ready to face whatever was coming next. But then, Charlie dropped the bombshell. "This man," he said, pointing at Jack, "this man is Lieutenant General Raymond Harris. You are standing in front of one of the most decorated war heroes this country has ever known. Vietnam, Gulf War, Black Ops." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, and the entire room went dead silent. Tank froze. His grin faltered, his jaw slackening as his brain tried to process the information. The other bikers exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier bravado draining from their faces. They had no idea who they had just picked a fight with. Charlie's voice cut through the stunned silence. "You think he's just some old man sitting in the corner? You have no idea the things this man has seen. You don't mess with someone like him." Jack remained calm, his eyes now focused on the group of bikers before him. Unblinking, he had no desire to escalate things further. But he wasn't about to let them disrespect him either. He had faced far greater dangers in his life than this group could ever imagine. He had led men into battle, had carried his brothers out of burning vehicles, had fought for his country and survived when no one thought he would. The tension in the room was palpable, and even Tank, who had always been the loudest in any room, could feel the weight of the moment. The room was silent, all eyes on the old man, waiting for him to speak, waiting for the inevitable. Jack's voice was steady, calm as ever. "You don't need to know my story to respect me," he said, his words resonating with a quiet strength. "But you should know this. There are battles you don't understand. And some people are worth respecting, even if you don't know why." The room seemed to hold its breath, the bikers now realizing they had gone too far. The silence in the bar was thick, suffocating even. The tension had reached a point where it felt like the air itself was waiting for something to break, something to change. The bikers, once so full of confidence and bravado, were now visibly unsettled. Tank, the leader of the group, stood frozen, his hand still holding Jack's military cap, his fingers trembling ever so slightly. The other bikers looked around, unsure of how to react. Their earlier cocky demeanor completely evaporated. They had expected a show, a confrontation to entertain them. But what they had stumbled into was something far deeper and far more dangerous than they could have imagined. Jack stood in front of them, his posture unbroken, his face impassive. He didn't look like the kind of man who needed to prove himself. His presence alone was enough to command respect. The air between them crackled with something unspoken, something ancient. For the first time, the biker seemed small, like children caught doing something they shouldn't. It wasn't just the fact that he was a decorated war hero, it was the way he carried himself. The way his every movement spoke of battles fought and won, of sacrifices made in the name of something greater than himself. Charlie, the bartender, took another step forward, his boots clicking on the wooden floor, a deliberate sound that sliced through the stillness. His voice was low but heavy with meaning. "You boys have no idea who you are messing with, do you?" Tank finally broke his gaze from Jack, looking at Charlie with a mixture of confusion and irritation. He couldn't understand what was happening. He had faced tough men before, had knocked down more than his fair share of would-be challengers. But this was different. There was something about Jack, something that made him feel like he was in the presence of a storm. Something that made him realize that the noise and the showmanship he relied on meant nothing here. "No," Tank muttered, his voice low. "We had no idea." Jack's eyes never left him. There was no triumph in his gaze, just quiet wisdom, the kind that only comes from having lived through more than most people could ever comprehend. He was about to speak again when Charlie cut in once more, his words sharp, slicing through the room with a brutal edge. "That man you're standing in front of," Charlie said, pointing at Jack, "is Lieutenant General Raymond Harris, one of the most decorated men this country has ever seen. You don't get that kind of recognition by being a show-off. You get it by surviving hell and coming back to tell the story. You are standing in front of a man who fought in Vietnam, who fought in the Gulf War, who did things that would haunt your nightmares. You think you are tough?" Charlie's voice hardened, and the words hit like a hammer, each one landing with a finality that left no room for argument. "You're not even in his league." The bikers froze. The room went still, the kind of stillness that comes when the weight of reality crashes down like a tidal wave. For the first time, Tank wasn't sure whether he should laugh or run. The thought of backing down, of being the one to let go of the cap in his hand, filled him with a sense of shame that he couldn't shake off. And yet, there was something in Jack's steady gaze that kept him rooted to the spot, unwilling to make a move. Jack broke the silence, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of a lifetime of experiences. "You think I want this?" he said, his eyes never leaving Tank's. "I didn't fight for medals. I fought for something far bigger than myself. I fought for my brothers, the men who stood by me when no one else would. And I lost some of them too. Every day, I carry their faces with me. You'll never understand that, Tank. You are too busy looking for a fight." The words landed like an echo in the room. The bikers, once loud and proud, now seemed to shrink under Jack's quiet authority. Tank, still holding the cap, finally lowered it slowly, as if it weighed more than he could carry. His eyes flickered to the other members of his crew, each one avoiding his gaze, each one uncomfortable in their own skin. The swagger, the confidence that had once defined them, was gone. Jack had stripped it away with nothing more than a few words. Jack stepped forward, slowly, his boots making soft, deliberate sounds as he crossed the room. The bikers instinctively stepped back, unsure of what would happen next. Jack didn't stop. He reached out, gently taking the cap from Tank's hand. For a brief moment, Tank didn't resist. His hand trembled as he let go, and Jack's fingers closed around the brim. He adjusted it slowly, as though it were a cherished possession, a symbol of everything he had lived through. "There's a difference between strength and arrogance," Jack said quietly, his voice carrying across the room. "Strength comes from knowing when to fight. and went to walk away. Arrogance. Arrogance comes from thinking you can take anything you want without consequences. Tank swallowed hard. His throat felt tight, his chest heavy with a weight he couldn't explain. For the first time, he wasn't sure what to do. He had always been the one in control, the one who made the rules. But standing in front of Jack, standing in front of a man who had seen more violence and hardship than he could ever imagine, Tank realized that he was nothing but a kid playing at being tough. The regulars in the bar watched in silence, their eyes wide with disbelief, as Jack placed the cap back on his head with a quiet, dignified gesture. The old man's movements were slow, deliberate, but there was no doubt about the power that emanated from him. He was not just a man, he was a force of nature. The kind of man who didn't need to prove himself to anyone. His presence alone commanded respect. Charlie stepped forward, his arms crossed, his eyes locked on the bikers. "This is what respect looks like," he said, his voice low but full of meaning. "It doesn't cost you anything to show it. But if you don't, you'll find yourself out of your depth real quick." Tank's jaw clenched, but his hands, which had been poised for action just moments before, now hung limply at his sides. The realization was starting to sink in, they had pushed too far. The older bikers, those who had been laughing and egging Tank on, now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The room was heavy with the silence of understanding. Jack didn't say another word. He turned slowly and made his way back to his corner, his presence still commanding the attention of the entire bar. He sat down, taking his seat with the quiet dignity of a man who had seen more than most could ever fathom. The clinking of glasses, the low murmur of conversation, slowly began to return, but the air was different now. The room had been changed. The bikers, once brash and bold, sat in stunned silence. Tank, his pride shattered, glanced at his crew. He didn't know what to say. For the first time in years, he felt like a fool. The confidence he had carried into the bar had crumbled into dust. The others, once loud and ready for a fight, now sat quietly, their beers untouched, their minds swirling with thoughts they had never had before. Charlie finally spoke, his voice soft but firm. "You've learned something tonight, whether you wanted to or not. Now, take it with you. And next time you think about messing with someone, remember who you are dealing with." Tank didn't answer. Instead, he nodded, his face red with embarrassment. For the first time, he understood what true strength was. It wasn't the roar of a loud voice or the swagger of a big man. It was the quiet dignity of someone who had nothing to prove. The minutes stretched on, and yet the room was as still as it had been when Jack first stood up to Tank. The regulars at Max's Roadhouse had resumed their conversations, but their voices were softer now, tinged with the weight of the earlier confrontation. The usual energy of the place had been tempered, and even the jukebox, which had been a staple of Friday nights, now seemed to play in the background, almost as if it too respected the quiet that had settled over the bar. Jack sat in his corner, his whiskey untouched, staring out the window as though lost in thought. His expression was unreadable, but there was a distant look in his eyes, one that spoke of battles fought long ago and memories that had become as much a part of him as the air he breathed. It wasn't just the war he had lived through, it was the weight of those who had fought and died by his side. The faces of those he had lost, their names carved into his soul, lingered with him every day. It was the kind of weight that never fully lifted, no matter how many years passed. Tank, on the other hand, was struggling with a heaviness of his own. His usual cocky demeanor had evaporated, replaced by an unsettling sense of discomfort. He sat at the bar, his beer untouched, the bottle in his hand now more of a prop than a drink. He had been the one in charge, the one who had called the shots. And now he felt like a child caught stealing cookies. His pride had been shattered by a man half his size. A man who hadn't even raised his voice but had commanded the room with nothing more than a few words. He glanced at his crew, his eyes flickering between them. They were all sitting there, just as silent, unsure of how to proceed. The same group that had come into the bar with swagger and attitude now seemed humbled. Almost defeated. Tank shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words felt foreign, stuck in his throat. He wanted to lash out, to challenge Jack again, but something held him back. Something he couldn't quite explain. It was a sense of respect, but also fear, a fear he didn't recognize in himself until now. One of the younger bikers, the one who had been most vocal earlier, leaned in and whispered, "You think we should apologize?" Tank didn't respond right away. The question lingered in the air, and Tank could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. What had started as a joke, as a test of power, had quickly spiraled into something much more profound. He had been rude, brash, and reckless, but now, in the face of Jack's quiet strength, he wasn't sure if an apology would even be enough. Before Tank could respond, Jack's calm voice cut through the air, pulling the attention of everyone in the bar. His words weren't directed at anyone in particular, but the power behind them was undeniable. "You boys think the world owes you something," Jack said, his voice carrying over the low murmur of the bar. His gaze swept over the bikers. And for the first time, Tank found himself unable to meet the old man's eyes. "I've seen men like you before. Men who think strength comes from the size of their muscles or how loud they can shout. But real strength," Jack's voice faltered for just a moment, and a flicker of something darker, more painful, passed over his face. "Real strength is something else entirely." Tank couldn't help but lean forward. His curiosity piqued despite himself. The words were starting to sink in, their meaning deeper than he had anticipated. Jack paused for a moment, as if weighing his next words carefully. The silence in the bar deepened, the regulars now hanging on to his every syllable. "When I was 19, Jack continued, his voice soft but firm, "I was thrown into the jungles of Vietnam, fresh out of basic training. No amount of training prepares you for what you face out there. The heat, the fear, the noise, the silence." The room seemed to quiet even further, and Tank could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The old man's words hit harder than anything Tank had ever felt before. This wasn't just a story about the past, this was a man who had lived through it all. A man who had stared death in the face and come back to tell the tale. Jack leaned back in his chair, his weathered face drawn with the weight of memories. His voice became softer as he continued. "There was this one mission. A rescue op. 2 of our guys were pinned down, surrounded by enemy fire. Command told us it was a suicide run. But we went anyway, not because we wanted to be heroes. No one thinks about medals in moments like that. We did it because leaving them behind wasn't an option." Tank sat motionless, his hands gripping his beer bottle so tightly his knuckles turned white. The other bikers were equally still, their attention fully on Jack. The old man's words seemed to have an almost magnetic pull, drawing everyone in, forcing them to listen. "We lost 2 men that day," Jack said, his voice cracking slightly, though he quickly regained his composure. "Good men. But we brought those boys home. I still see their faces sometimes. Those we lost and those we saved. Every time I do, I remind myself that real strength isn't about what you take. It's about what you're willing to give." The bar was completely silent now. No one dared to speak. Jack's words had taken root, settling in the hearts of everyone present. Even the bikers, who had once been so full of noise and bravado, now sat in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Tank's earlier cocky grin, his arrogance, had all but disappeared. In its place was something far more profound, a sense of shame, but also a new understanding of what it meant to truly be strong. Jack paused again, allowing his words to sink in. The room seemed to hang in the balance, as if no one dared to break the silence. Finally, Jack spoke again, his voice quieter, but still carrying the same weight. "You think you are tough," Jack said, his eyes locking onto Tank's for the first time since the confrontation began. "But what does that really mean? You think toughness is about picking on the weak, or putting others down to make yourself feel bigger? Real toughness," Jack said, his voice rising slightly, "is about lifting others up. It's about standing tall in the face of adversity. And it's about doing what's right, even when no one else is looking. It's about fighting for something that matters." Tank swallowed hard, his throat tight. He had never considered that kind of toughness before. He had always thought of strength in terms of power, of control, of being the one who called the shots. But now, standing in front of Jack, he realized that he had been wrong. His idea of strength had been shallow, built on pride and ego. It was nothing compared to what this old man had endured. Jack's words lingered in the air, heavy with truth. "You'll get by with arrogance for a while. Maybe you'll even intimidate a few people. But in the end, it's your character that matters. It's your integrity. And you don't build that by tearing others down. You build it by showing respect, by living with honor." The room was still. The bikers, once so boisterous and confident, were now silent. They sat, as if frozen, as Jack's voice filled the space between them. Each word a lesson, each syllable a challenge to the very foundation of who they thought they were. Finally, Tank spoke, his voice strained but sincere. "I didn't know," he said, his words coming out rough, as if they had been trapped inside him for far too long. "I didn't know what I was doing. I'm sorry for everything." The other bikers, too, mumbled their apologies, their voices quieter, more genuine than anything they had said all night. The weight of Jack's lesson had shifted something deep inside them, something that would stay with them long after the night ended. Jack nodded once, his gaze steady and calm. "Apologies don't mean much if they're not followed by action," he said softly, "but I'll take your word for it. Just remember this moment." The tension that had gripped Max's roadhouse for what seemed like hours began to dissipate. But the weight of the moment lingered in the air. The bikers, once loud and rebellious, now sat in silence, their beers untouched, the earlier bravado replaced with introspection. Even Tank, the loudest and most confident of the group, now seemed a shadow of the man he had been just hours ago. His eyes, usually sharp and full of challenge, were now soft, searching for something he hadn't known he had lost: respect. Jack sat in his corner, the once dim light now casting a warm glow over him. He hadn't spoken again after his powerful words, but the silence spoke volumes. He didn't need to say more. His presence was enough. The man who had seen and survived more than most could ever imagine. The man who had carried others through hell and back wasn't there to show off or seek attention. He was there to remind them, remind everyone, that the strength of a man is not measured by his ability to dominate or control, but by his capacity to endure, to sacrifice, and to lift others up. The room was quieter than it had ever been, but the usual hum of the bar was now replaced with a new kind of energy, one that was reflective, somber, almost reverent. The regulars who had witnessed the transformation in the bikers couldn't help but glance toward Jack every now and then. There was a newfound sense of admiration in their eyes. A recognition of the old man's quiet authority. It was the kind of respect that was earned, not demanded. Charlie, the bartender, leaned against the counter, arms folded, his expression softened. His eyes, once hardened by years of managing bar fights and unruly patrons, now carried the quiet wisdom of someone who had witnessed a moment of real change. He glanced at the bikers, who sat still, their earlier raucousness gone. They had learned something tonight, whether they fully understood it or not. After what felt like an eternity, Tank finally broke the silence. His voice was low, almost unrecognizable. I never thought I'd be sitting here, feeling like this, he said, his gaze shifting to his crew, each one of them avoiding his eyes. There was no bravado in his tone, no pride, just an aching realization of how far they had gone wrong. One of the younger bikers, the one who had laughed the loudest earlier, spoke up hesitantly. We were just messing around. Man, we didn't know. His voice trailed off, the weight of his words pressing down on him. He glanced over at Jack, his face flushed with embarrassment. I'm sorry, sir. We didn't mean to disrespect you. Tank nodded slowly, his hands clenching around his beer bottle. We should have known better, he said, his voice tight. I'm sorry too. We didn't know who you were. But now we do. Jack didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes. He had taught them what they needed to learn. And now it was up to them to carry that lesson forward. He wasn't interested in hearing apologies. They were hollow if they weren't backed by change. But in his eyes, he saw something, a flicker of sincerity, an acknowledgement of their mistakes. Finally, Jack's voice broke the silence once more, low and steady, like the rumble of distant thunder. I don't need your apologies. What I need is for you to learn something from this. Respect doesn't cost you anything, but lack of it can cost you everything. His words were simple, yet profound. They weren't just meant for Tank and his crew, they were meant for everyone in the bar. For the regulars who had watched the scene unfold. For the people who had taken their own lives for granted. Who had failed to understand the value of true strength and humility. Tank swallowed hard, his throat thick with emotion. He nodded slowly, as if to himself. We get it, old man, he said, his voice rough with the weight of his realization. We get it. Charlie, who had been watching the exchange from behind the bar, finally spoke up. You boys have a long way to go, he said gruffly, though there was a slight smile in his eyes. But you've taken the first step. Now, it's up to you to prove you've learned something. The other bikers, too, muttered their apologies, their voices low and sincere. The air in the bar had shifted. And it wasn't just because of Jack's presence. It was because something had changed within the bikers themselves. They were no longer the same group of rowdy, reckless men who had walked into the bar hours ago. They had seen something, felt something, that had altered their perspective. Something that would stay with them long after the night was over. Jack, for his part, stood up slowly, the movement deliberate but fluid. He adjusted his military cap, taking one last look around the room. His eyes met Tank's for a brief moment. And this time, there was no animosity in his gaze. Only a quiet understanding. You've had your fun, Jack said softly, his voice carrying the same quiet authority it had from the beginning. Now, sit down, finish your drinks, and let this be the end of it. Tank didn't say anything more. He simply nodded, his expression sober. The rest of the bikers followed suit. their movements slow and reflective. They knew they had been changed by what had just transpired. As Jack made his way toward the door, the entire bar seemed to hold its breath. The regulars watched him leave, their eyes filled with something more than just respect. It was admiration, a deep, unspoken acknowledgement of the man who had shown them a better way. Jack stepped out into the cool night air, the stars overhead twinkling like distant beacons. He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath as if savoring the stillness of the world around him. He had spent a lifetime teaching lessons through his actions, and tonight had been no different. He knew the bikers would carry his lesson with them. But more importantly, he knew they had seen something that couldn't be easily forgotten. As Jack walked away, the sound of his boots on the pavement faded into the night. Inside the bar, the once rowdy group of bikers had been transformed. They weren't the same men who had walked in hours ago. They had learned, the hard way, that true strength came from within. And as the night returned to its usual rhythm, they understood that the lesson Jack had taught them would stick with them, shaping who they were from that moment on. The bartender, Charlie, stood at the counter, watching the bikers silently sip their drinks. Lost in thought, he picked up Jack's empty glass, holding it for a moment before gently placing it into the sink. That's the kind of man who reminds you what honor looks like, he muttered to no one in particular. The bar slowly returned to its usual rhythm. But it was different now. The energy had shifted, and everyone who had been part of the night's events would remember it forever. Not because of the drama or the confrontation, but because of the lesson they had all learned. True strength is measured by the respect you give to others, and the humility with which you carry your own battles. As the night drew to a close, the patrons of Max's Roadhouse carried the quiet weight of Jack's words with them, knowing that they had witnessed something rare, something valuable, and for the bikers, the lesson would not be forgotten. It would stay with them, guiding them in ways they couldn't yet fully understand, but in time, they would. As the dust settles on this night at Max's Roadhouse, it's not just the bikers who have been changed. Everyone who witnessed this moment, whether they were sitting at the bar or just passing through, was given a powerful reminder. A reminder of something simple yet profound: respect. Life can often make us feel like we need to prove ourselves. We get caught up in the noise, the need to be loud, to be seen, to stand out. We wear our pride like armor, trying to protect ourselves from vulnerability, from being misunderstood, from feeling small. But tonight, we saw something different. We saw a man who didn't need to shout to be heard, who didn't need to tear others down to feel powerful. He taught us that true strength isn't about how loud you are, it's about how quietly you stand firm in the face of adversity. Jack, the old man in the corner, wasn't looking for attention. He wasn't trying to teach a lesson. But sometimes, life has a funny way of putting us exactly where we need to be, when we need to be there. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it was with a calm that made you listen, a presence that demanded respect. And in his silence, in the weight of his words, we learned that real strength comes from humility, from being able to sit in the quiet and reflect on who you are and what you stand for. As for the bikers, they came in looking for a fight, looking for a way to assert their dominance. But what they walked away with was something far more valuable, a lesson in humility, in character, and in understanding that no matter how tough you think you are, there's always someone who's been through more, who's seen more, and who's earned the right to be heard. The truth is, we all carry scars, whether we wear them on the outside or keep them hidden. And just because you don't see someone's battle doesn't mean it isn't there. Each person you meet has a story, a struggle, a past, and just as you hope for respect and understanding, It's important to remember that we are all deserving of it, no matter who we are, where we come from, or what we've been through. So, let's take a moment to reflect on the lesson Jack left behind. The next time you find yourself in a situation where you feel the need to prove something, to act tough, to dominate, remember that true strength lies in lifting others up, in showing kindness, in listening with an open heart. It's not about what you can take from others, it's about what you're willing to give. Respect doesn't cost you a thing, but it can make a world of difference. And remember, you don't need to know someone's story to treat them with kindness and dignity. In the end, it's not the loudest voice that makes the biggest impact, it's the one that speaks with integrity, that listens with empathy, and that always shows respect. Life is too short to be anything but kind. And as Jack reminded us, sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply be still, be respectful, and give others the space to be heard.